On opening government, we believe that the institution of competitive sports are important to nations and are important to communities. We think that what we want out of this debate is to ensure that the benefits of sports, which we really believe on Gov's side are incredibly important, can be spread to all teams that are worthy of things like institutional support and the money that they need to access the resources to get there in the first place. We want those to accrue to the mass majority of individuals and to poor teams and not just rich teams. What we want you to imagine is if, as a competitive debate team, the only 2 or 3 tournaments that you could attend every year was one small, poorly ran regional tournament, Euros, and Nationals. We think that when poor teams cannot be competitive at a real level that is meaningful in ways that can accrue institutional support, they can never get those benefits that we think. That is not okay. We've got a fairly simple model here. We don't want this to turn it into a model debate, but what we think is leagues like the NFL, the FIFA, the EIFA, the MLB, things such as that could, either progressively tax or institute like a 14% flat tax on sports institutions. We don't particularly care in the way in which they're taxed, but basically what we want to make sure is that at the end of taxations, that teams who are poor have enough money to be able to register for tournaments, to be able to even afford coaches in the first place, decent coaches nevertheless, to be able to ensure that they can pay their players for a contract so that there's any incentive to join those sports teams in the first place. We are perfectly fine with that. That what you need to understand in this debate, right, is that this taxation will happen and it will be substantial enough to where teams will be able to redistribute that wealth to those poorer teams and it will be enough. 3 points for you today. No. First, how leagues have a duty to tax and redistribute. Second of all, how redistribution allows teams to be competitive by allocating resources. And third of all, how this can create local community role models that fulfill the cycle of sports and its benefits. First point, why leagues have a duty. We would say that sports teams, especially sports leagues specifically, often employ rhetoric about community and competition as a sport, right? Sports is about spreading entertainment. Sports is about spreading culture to all. Sports are about the esteem of work ethic and competition, therefore in the first place, right? If you are on a team or some sort of program being sponsored, for instance, in the United States by the NFL, that is all they are telling you. They're telling you what the importance of sports teams are. We think that if leagues are going to employ this rhetoric, and we think that if leagues are truly committed to the principles of competitive sports and the kind of culture that it promotes, we think that they ought to be taking steps to ensure that those benefits and that culture are spread to everyone rather than just the teams who are able to afford it. We think at the point at which poor teams cannot access the kind of level of community and benefits that sports league really would so desire them to get to, leagues need to do their best, in this case, taxing and redistribution to ensure that they can be allocated the money and the resources that get them there on the first place. Just on the basis of a duty and a principle of sports leagues, this is why they are perfectly justified and have a finite responsibility to tax and redistribute. But secondly, what we would tell you is that redistribution allows teams to be competitive. 2 things under here. First of all, what this allows them to do is to afford the price of a competition in first place. So recognize that as it currently stands, poor teams have an incredibly difficult time attending competitions, right? And if they are actually attending competitions, they're either A, not of very good quality, or B, they're just saving up for the big, very important tournaments so that they can do anything they possibly can to achieve any sort of accreditation by saying, at least doing well at some large regional tournament like like the champion leagues for soccer, for example. Again, as I told you in the very beginning, imagine if you as a competitive debate team only went to like 3 tournaments and 2 of them you have an impossible chance of ever doing well at because you don't have the fundamental resources that allow you to be a good sports team in the very first place. You can never accrue that kind of accreditation because you fundamentally do not have the resources to do so. That disadvantages sports teams in a lot of ways. Second of all, what we think they get is more equal access to resource. Maybe not perfectly, but at least we make some sort of major improvement on that side of the house. What this allows teams to do is to afford coaches, right? Even if they can attend the tournaments, if you don't have the money to ensure that those teams are very good, they're never going to get anywhere. You allow equipment and safety training. You allow the venue so that you can even get onto a field and practice in the very first place, right? Getting more practice, the whole practice makes perfect thing is incredibly important for sports teams. I'll get you at the very end of this point here. Ensuring training that richer teams are allowed to get to that makes them better and competitive, therefore, in the first place are really important. What are the impacts of this? Recognize that if you establish yourself as a team that can ever be competitive, you're more likely to get institutional support. So what that means is that if you can establish yourself as the team that actually means anything, you achieve some sort of reputation in your university or in your nation here in the very first place. That allows you to plaster yourself all over the walls of a country for advertisement. It makes the institution of sports valuable in your country, right? If you are a university or a primary or a high school that looks at your sports team on the upper echelons as unsuccessful, you're probably very unlikely to ever invest in community sports teams in the very first place and never accrue the kind of benefits of competition and work ethic that sports actually derives from that. Recognize that once you establish yourself as legitimate and the sport of, say, football or soccer, or tennis, you're probably more likely to invest in those kinds of activities. Those activities are incredibly important, just as important as a speech and debate team would be. No thank you. But moreover, what we think, in this third and final point, we think that this can establish things like role models. So the benefits of sports we think we've made very clear, right? Things like the solidarity of people, things like work ethic, and being able to establish unification. These are all the things that we love about sports, and of course, the spectacle. Sports are just very, very fun to watch, and sometimes can define a nation. We think when we look at role models in sports, for instance, in the United States, the perfect example would be something like LeBron James, right? We think when you are younger and you can see role models in sports that can be effective in establishing community and investing in those, you're actually going to get those in the first place. Unfortunately, in sports, a lot of the times, you can never build that from the bottom up because you never establish that sport in legitimate in the first place. If you do not have sports in communities, like straight out of like first, second, and third grade, you're never going to be able to build up the building up the resources. This establishes the legitimacy that you need to create sports as a legitimate institution in your nation, in your university, quite literally anywhere. So, in summary, what we think this debate is about resources for competitive sports and ensuring that everyone gets access to them. We think leagues have a fundamental duty if they believe sports are for all. We think the redistribution allows resources, which creates the establishment as competitive and allows for local role models and investment in community to accrue. And because of those reasons, we are exceptionally proud to propose. Thank you.
Panel, if it is true, as opening government wanted to claim, that sport is a right, then we actually think on opening opposition that it should be the state executing this redistribution and taxing of this wealth. We don't think it should be done by bureaucrats of these leagues that we're talking about in this debate. We believe they will do this badly, but even if they didn't do it badly, we also think this is principally unjust and we definitely shouldn't do it. Most of the rebuttal will be integrated with substantive in this speech, but the first thing I want to address is we don't think that in terms of like the model that the opening government has put forward, we don't necessarily think that the 14% flat tax is necessarily fulfilling their burden of like significantly taxing and redistributing these clubs. Moreover, that means that all of the benefits that they wanted to claim are probably weakened by the fact that this is a comparatively like weaker tax and like that they are going to institute. With that in mind, let's look at three issues in this speech. The first of which is whether these clubs do have a duty and whether this is principally a just or unjust thing to do. Secondly, a question of who qualifies as a small club sufficient to receive this funding, and then this like redistribution of wealth, and finally some more practical outcomes. So firstly, on the principles, we heard from opening government that like these clubs have a duty to do this because they promote this rhetoric of community and fun, and they need to do all that they can to fulfil that. I would point to examples like Coke and McDonald's, who also employ the rhetoric of like community and fun in trying to advertise their products. Does that mean that they are now responsible to provide for poorer fast food and drink companies to like so that they can like continue to perpetuate that rhetoric? I would say probably not. More substantively on principles, let's consider that these like sporting leagues and clubs are businesses. They are private entities. So the money that they have, of the money that these clubs have, belongs actually to their members. These are the people who pay their fees and pay for merchandise, but moreover, it is these people who necessarily attract the sponsors and the companies who want to advertise with that club, because the more members you have, the greater exposure you will have when advertising your product. So effectively, all of the money that a club has is the property of their members, and we think that it is unjust that someone who pays for a membership to a specific club, possibly because they have a deep connection to that club, maybe some of their family members have played in that club, they might want their children who are interested in sport, no thank you, to play for that club into the future. It is unjust then for that money to get removed from that club by the bureaucrats involved with that league. Let's also consider an important question why this is different to other forms of taxation, and it's the very issue that I identified in my introduction, that it is not the state doing it. So if there is a right to sport that the opening government seem to want to imply, then we would support the state allocating more resources to poorer clubs, and we would support the state raising taxes to pay for that, no thank you. But this is a league, and we don't think they are necessarily bound by the same obligations. And we'd ask the government bench in this debate whether they believe that in the music industry, record labels should tax the high-profile people who they have in that label and redistribute that wealth to independent musicians. So should XL Records tax Adele significantly and redistribute that to the independent musicians? We would contest not. I will take you.
Yeah, right. Don't misconstrue and strawman what we said. We never said sports was a right, and we never said it was a public good, which is exactly why we wouldn't tax the public.
Okay, right. So sport is now not a right. So I feel like that kind of seems to have a bit of a tension with your own case, because the kind of points that you were talking about are the duty for these sporting clubs to expand the rhetoric of community and fun and make it more inclusive. That seems like not something that is that is then a bit of a tension in your case with not providing that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the second question in this debate of who actually qualifies for this funding, because we think that what we're doing here is effectively creating a pot of money, and so that any small club is necessarily eligible for this, and it's unclear which clubs will get it. We think a lot of clubs are actually likely to start up just for the purpose of receiving this money, and while this might not seem like a particular problem, it's important to recognise we don't think all clubs are good, right? We think that many clubs are actually pretty awful to their members and don't provide them the kind of things that they should get. So the example from Australia that we would point to is the Newcastle Jets in the A-League, the Australian soccer league, that is owned by a mining magnate who doesn't particularly have any interest in promoting that sport and giving back to their members. It is a money-making exercise. So it's important to recognise that poor clubs can still be owned by very rich people, billionaires in some cases. These clubs are not poor because of structural issues and structural disadvantage. They are poor simply because they do a bad job at providing for their members, and people do not want to join those clubs. They are not attracted to them. So ultimately, we think that the people who are deciding how this redistribution occurs ultimately need to discriminate. We think the bureaucrats are probably the wrong people to do this. The final issue I'm going to discuss is some more practical outcomes, and this is where I'll integrate some more rebuttal of opening government. The main plank of their case on this point was that the sport would become more competitive, because teams would be able to, poorer teams would be able to afford the price of registration, and it would also make them more competitive. The first thing we'd say is about affording the price of registration. We're happy for FIFA to subsidise some of their entry to those competitions. We think that's different to the significant redistribution that is the burden of the government bench in this debate. But on making the sport more competitive, we would say at best that is not automatic. But we'd also say that making the sport competitive requires a thriving culture in that club to be successful and to continue to attract good players in the future who want to play for that club. That is not necessarily going to happen simply by throwing money at the problem, no thank you. So more substantively on practical outcomes, it's important to recognise what this looks like is that big city clubs like Chelsea in the English Premier League funding comparatively local and smaller clubs, and internationally it looks like FIFA taking from European clubs and possibly giving to Brazilian clubs. We think the problem here is, particularly when this has a significant redistribution of that funding, is very dependent that those smaller clubs become very dependent on that league for their funding and for their survival. That creates a huge power imbalance in negotiations where in terms of potentially issues where those tournaments are hosted, right? Because what we think disadvantages small clubs is that those tournaments are always located in Europe, and their fans can never attend. They can never create that thriving culture. We think sports leagues then get a lot of influence, then they are like so important to the survival of those poorer clubs that they could essentially pull funding at any time and seriously disadvantage them. That means that those clubs are less likely to lobby successfully for tournaments to be hosted in their countries. It's important to recognise that those clubs are saying that they need to host those tournaments to attract sponsors and to attract more funding. We remove that ammunition, and FIFA then makes those decisions and say, and essentially say to those clubs, there is no grounds for them to protest because they're already funded. That means that we never host a tournament in a non-Western nation. We think that's more important because it fosters the fan bases and increases the pie instead of simply redistributing it. Panel, at the end of this speech, it should be very clear that bureaucrats in the league were the wrong people to be taxing and redistributing this wealth. If it was the case that this is something we principally should be doing, we would much prefer the state to do that. Proud to oppose.
Honourable panel, we're perfectly fine, on principle, taxing these wealthier teams who oftentimes have such excesses of money over the less wealthy teams, over the poorer teams that the motion talks about, even if they don't have to. We think that it is reasonable to say when businesses provide something for society, and we say this most of the time with things like regulations and governments as well, it is reasonable to say that we want this to be done in a fair and equitable way that can benefit everybody. That is what the opening government brings you about in this debate. We see the benefits of sport in our culture, and we want that to benefit everybody. How are we going to do it? Two things I want to talk about today in my Deputy of Prime Minister's speech. I want to talk about the real importance of sport in our culture, and then secondly, I'm going to talk about why on principle we stand for fair sport. But first, a few points of deconstruction. When we get this idea that clubs don't have to do it, right? Clubs don't have to do it because, and members shouldn't have to pay a tax if they're insanely wealthy because they pay their membership dues or something like this. We think that it is perfectly fine on principle for opening government to propose to you when these teams have massive excesses of wealth to propose this kind of tax and bring it and make sports a much more fair activity for everyone. But second, we also get this idea coming out of the LO that the counter plan is for the state to fund these kind of things. If they really recognize, if they concede to us that sports culture is so important, they want to say the state should tax it. Why don't we like this on principle? Because we don't think it should be taxpayers, that is everybody in the public, paying for sports teams when there's ridiculously wealthy billionaires like Saad Khan, who owns the Jacksonville Jaguars, who has plenty of excess money to do it. We find it ridiculous for the opening opposition to propose that taxpayers who aren't all invested in sports could pay that. We have people with large excesses of money, the wealthier teams that are talked about, and we much rather have them do that instead. But thirdly, we get this idea that FIFA should, they kind of try to squirrel away from it by saying FIFA should subsidize travel instead. Well, first, we don't think travel is the only problem here. We think things like equipment, things like venues, things like being able to attract better players are also incredibly important for a team to have the ability to compete and to have the ability to create the good kinds of things and the importance of sport culture that I'm going to talk to you about in my DPM. No. And then fourthly, we get this idea about these teams will never be able to host. We don't understand the causal link here. We think when teams become more successful and have more revenues coming in because they're a more successful team, because they were subsidized by these taxes, they're much more likely to be get a bid to host a tournament or something like that. Okay, first, what is the importance of sports culture? Three things we believe. One, we believe there is an importance to entertainment. And don't underestimate the importance of entertainment in this debate panel. We think that entertainment is incredibly important and that it allows people to have some kind of reflex away from their daily lives. It allows them to have something that they can de-stress and relax and have a way to enjoy their life. We think in all societies it's important for people to have this kind of thing, and we think that sports fills that unique role for many people in our cultures. But secondly, we also think it creates a solidarity in culture. And we don't think this is just in professional sports teams, but also amateur sports teams as well. We think that this solidarity in culture brings kind of friendship together in communities. We think that people can come together in communities for sports teams and have something that they all collectively identify with and have something that allows them to create discussions and things like that. For instance, Steelers fans in Pittsburgh, it's always something to talk about. It's always something to start conversations, and we think that's a good thing. But secondly, we also think it allows them to change narratives in their cultures. For instance, we think sports plays an important role in changing narratives because people come together and respect sports and they use it as like, and they could put it up on a pedestal. For instance, like Babe Ruth when he joined the MLB, or like that's like, you know, if you've seen the Remember the Titans movie, when they allowed African Americans onto college football teams in the United States. This did a lot to start taking down racism in the United States of America. When people saw that solidarity was being represented in something that they find so culturally important like sports, this helped to change those narratives. But thirdly, like my partner talks about, we get this concept of role models, right? We do have role models. We have people that grew up in your city and were able to make it to a higher stature in life, and they become this role model for you, and they become something that you can look up to and something that you can look to in the future. But the third impact we see from this is we see revenue in jobs. We see money coming in from sports teams. We see when we have successful sports teams in these kind of situations, that there's a lot of money that comes in. This creates jobs, not only jobs for like players, but jobs for people who might work the hot dog stand at a stadium, and we think this is better economically for everyone. So before I get into my idea of a principle of fair sport, I will take front half.
Okay. The problem is that when sports teams are the ones in charge of making sure everyone gets access to sport, they are only funding their own sport and their own leagues, which is likely to discriminate against women or minority sports. What's your solution to that when the government can clearly avoid those problems? Okay,
we could tax women leagues, we could tax minority leagues as well. We could tax all leagues that are inclusive for everybody. I don't understand where this kind of exclusivity happens. We're not only talking about like taxing certain kinds of one kind of sports leagues like football or one kind of sports league like men's soccer. We're talking about taxing all kinds of sports leagues where there's a disparity. This includes men's leagues, women's leagues, minority leagues, or leagues where men and women both are involved. Second, why do we believe in a principle of fair sport? One, we think it's simply more entertaining. And at this point, we actually think there is an incentive for sports leagues to actually do this even without any kind of principled way either. We think it's simply more entertaining when there's more competition between teams. We think when there's more teams all together in a pool, it creates a much more entertaining spirit when we could watch the games and actually wonder who's going to win instead of thinking, oh, you know, the Yankees are going to win again. Or if you've ever seen like UConn's women's basketball team that's now won 5 championships in a row, it starts to get kind of boring when one team keeps winning all the time. We think leagues have a clear incentive to subsidize these teams so that there's more competition, so more people are watching, not only from like one part of the country, but we can have more people watching from all parts of the country or all parts of the world with International Sports League, for instance. But secondly, we think that all these benefits of culture that we talk to get that spread to everybody. And we think on principle, we want sports leagues to spread these benefits, these important benefits that they have been able to bring to our society. What we think this means is that everybody can get the benefit of this entertainment. We think in like parts of the world where there's not many other kinds of recourse of entertainment, a soccer team can be incredibly important for like a reason to like decompress and de-stress your life and watch some soccer. We think like things like they could use sports for solidarity. It's a way for people to collectively come together and have something that is like away from the conflicts of their lives and come together and have friendships. But we also think this creates local role models because we think in the status quo what happens most of the time is sports players who grow up in a certain area like South Africa will end up going play for like Barcelona up in Spain, and they can't be a role model for the people that they grew up around anymore, their communities anymore, because they've been poached. We think when we give teams much more money, they can incentivize players from their own local communities to go to those sports teams and become role models for the communities that they grew up in. But fourthly, we also think this allows that revenue to spread to everybody, right? We think it allows everybody, all teams to begin to sell merchandise. We think it begins all teams in all cities in all teams to be able to bring in this revenue that comes from people just coming to the stadium and sitting down and watching, and we think this is beneficial for the economies in those places. We believe that sports holds a very important place in our culture, ladies and gentlemen, and we think that we want those benefits on principle to spread to all. We believe in that principle of fair sport. We're proud to propose.
Panel, you've heard a lot about how people have the right to sport. That only proves that those clubs who are currently struggling should have access to funds. It does not at all prove where those funds should come from, especially when those funds are owned and made by members who signed up for that club, attracted those advertisers on the premise that those funds would return to those clubs where their families were. What we're going to offer you in side opposition in closing is that the comparative between the state, if sport really is a right, is one where state funding will be far more equitable and far less susceptible to discriminatory imbalances between minorities. Secondly, why we think the reaction to this policy will render it completely ineffective and actually put the burden on like kind of middling clubs, not the super rich. And lastly, how we think, and again, I'm going to ask, who is eligible for this. This will put a lot of money in billionaires' pockets whether you want to avoid it or not. First thing, principles. Okay, the only thing they've given us as to why clubs owe a special obligation above and beyond any other business is that they use the language of community. Well, what if they stop using the language of community and just want to play the sport? Do they suddenly not obligated to pay this tax? Simply saying that we think everyone should have access to sport simply gives the government a mandate to fund sports teams, and many governments do. Many governments do fund local sports teams or have national sports organisations which reach out to rural communities and whatnot. When they just say we want people to have more fun and these rich people simply have a lot of spare money, is really the slippery slope into communism if you think about it. Because if it's just a matter of we should just take money from whoever's got a lot of it and fund nice social programs, that is a policy for just taking money away from whoever's rich. Unfortunately, you've got to deal with the externalities of your policy often create perverse incentives which do discriminate against who gets those funds and the way in which those funds are allocated. And that's what I'm going to elucidate to you now. If it is the government distributing the funds, it doesn't discriminate against what sport gets the funds. So, for example, we imagine under your policy, football leagues are likely to get way more funding than netball leagues were. And something you can't avoid is that, unfortunately, football is dominated by men and things like netball are dominated by women. So the only beneficiaries of your redistributive policies are leagues with existing large pools of wealth, and secondly, leagues with, particularly dominant clubs who have the money to go away. And that when their only response is to my POI, well, we'll tax them all, we'll tax the women's league. There isn't the equivalent of a Chelsea in the women's netball league. There isn't an incredibly rich benefactor. So what you effectively do is you only accrue your benefits to existingly entrenched powerful sports. So that means that people who don't want to play soccer or don't want to play football or don't want to play tennis are excluded. Unfortunately, all of those sports are completely dominated by men and often exclude other minorities. The comparative you have to deal with on the outside of the house is where a government can give these people to not just whom are struggling financially, but who are also struggling culturally. And we think that the cultural struggles directly, in the Venn diagram, they're in a completely different bubble to what they're talking about, because those who are struggling culturally do not have extremely wealthy clubs for whom they can tax redistributively. Your policy only helps to, help, the most advantaged of the least advantaged. Second point, why the reaction to this policy will render it completely ineffective. Okay. What we're going to say here is that there is a very strong incentive for rich clubs not to give away lots of their money. I know you've heard that it's a 14% flat tax. We completely reject that is the adequate fulfillment of your burden. We are talking about a significant redistribution. To us, that looks like making Chelsea approximately as wealthy as the lower clubs, or something close to that. Closing is nodding their head. I'm glad they'll be the first government team to actually prop the motion. What we think this looks like is Chelsea will not want to give away a lot of its money. Its members won't want to give away a lot of that money. They do not want to see their facilities being unable to be maintained anymore. And that's what it really looks like, okay? Because the sort of facilities these clubs currently have are not cheap to maintain, and they will cease being able to do so, and they will cease being able to rent out those sports grounds if they have to give them this amount of money away. How will they react? For a start, membership will drop dramatically. They just won't become members. Because you don't need to be a member to watch the games. You don't really need to be a member to turn on the TV and to gain the benefits of the sport, right? But if you feel like your membership, right, 2% of it or 10% of it even is going to your club, and the rest is going to other clubs who you have no particularly cares about, many clubs who you're in competition with, you are unlikely to become a member anymore. So you shrink the pie for everyone. Secondly, we think that the mega rich clubs who have extremely wealthy benefactors are likely to just have the benefactor buy the sports ground and rent it out for free, so as to artificially diminish the wealth of the club, which means that you don't actually get any of the tax benefits you want. Instead, it just becomes this kind of really shady off-the-books thing where these clubs seem really not wealthy on paper, but in fact they've got an English aristocrat just donating all of the equipment, stuff which your policy will completely miss. Second thing they said was that, but the clubs want this because it increases competition. Clubs have more priorities than just increasing competition. They don't want, for example, membership to fall through the floor, and we think that if it's what's going to be in the league's best interest, we think that sticking to the status quo is the way to go. Honestly, if this was really in the league's best interest, they probably would have done it already. They haven't, because it's a terrible idea for them. I'll take one from closing. You've been oddly quiet. No, opening, go for it.
Right, so we don't think that this is necessarily the case, right? That people who are already having membership are extremely rich. The point at which this is attacked to make sure more people can get involved is a drop in the bucket for them.
Premise of that POI. Everyone who's a membership of a sports club is extremely rich. I don't know how many pubs you've been in, mate, when people play football and cricket and English soccer. They are not all wealthy aristocrats. Many of them are working class. They, in fact, use your own analysis as to why sport's so important for community building. It is the locals in the community who are having their money plundered from them, not rich aristocrats. Okay, last question in this debate. Who is eligible for this funding? And like really, they did not even give us in their model a criteria at all as to who would be eligible. So as far as we're concerned, and a harm which people gave you, which was completely ignored, is that many people are just going to see this pot of money, start a club, get some players together and start demanding funds and start using it to pay off bureaucrats. And it's important to note here, this policy runs the real risk of redistributing to clubs who aren't small because they're structurally disadvantaged. They're small because they suck, because they spend all of their money not on equipment and community programs, because they spend all of their money into bureaucracy and they spend all their money into commentators. And that is true of many, many clubs. Many clubs which you're talking about are not just like a group of friends, who really want to make it in the EPL one day. They're bought out by some sort of, rich Saudi or in Australia, mining magnates. All the time, regularly buy clubs and kind of just have them as a bit of a sideshow. And the reason those clubs suck and don't get much membership isn't because, they are structurally disadvantaged. It's because they are the plaything of a rich benefactor and not actually serving the community. They are not giving back, and that is why they are not receiving funds in return. Your policy gives more money to those awful clubs and takes it away from the clubs who are serving their members to the point where the members feel like voluntarily giving up their money to support it. Ultimately, this was a policy which, when in comparison to the state, discriminated based on gender and culture and took money away from clubs who had done the work for their members and gave it to ones who had an awful idea proud to oppose.
In my speech, I will extend on why we have the right to do it, because basically these huge clubs have monopolies that need to be destroyed to have a level playing field. I will show you how the whole way how sports is done changes from, at the moment, a negative way, a negative competition against each other, to a positive competition, and basically frame a lot on why we should look at more the really professional big money leagues and not these semi-professional teams that struggle to even are allowed to compete. So, but for that, 3 points of rebuttal. We heard from the externalities here, different problems. But first, the state should do it because the state could equalize different sports. So, the value of sports overall has no specific value for a community or for a country, because there's no real production of anything like a car. The only value comes out of the amusement by the viewers, by the amusement of the spectators. So basically, if the spectators all decide they want to view one certain kind of sport, then this is already utility maximizing for its people. So basically, for the government to take money away from football to give it to some other sport that no one is interested in is a negative. It's a net loss basically for the community overall. So that's why we are in favor of doing it just within the sport that the community has decided they want to see, and to maximize their the benefit that they have from it here. And we heard that a club like Chelsea couldn't maintain their facilities. Little reality check. Within these huge sports leagues, about 60 or 70% of the budgets of the clubs is purely in player salaries. They are spending 500 million plus and so on simply on their players. And if you simply take away one of their players, then basically all of their facilities are paid for. This really isn't a problem. And then I completely don't understand how the membership drop thing works. The money comes from winnings in the big leagues, like Champions League is 150 million or something. It comes mainly from TV contracts, 400 million in the UK. It comes from merchandising, which is a lot of money, but it is not the fucking membership fees. They are really, really small amounts of money compared to anything else that is changing here. And if you say yourself, in the UK, in the pubs, there are all these working class people that are members, they won't be paying the big bucks that you need for this to change in any way. So this is surprisingly irrelevant. So, why should we talk about the big clubs here. So about the big money leagues like, I guess, the NBA and the NFL, but the Premier League a lot, the Bundesliga, Primera one, etc. Because in these cases, a lot of the problem comes from the distribution of the prize money and other money sources within there. So for example, if you're a top club in the Bundesliga, you can compete in the Champions League. If you win there, you get 150 million just for the year, which is more than the poorer clubs have as their overall budget for players. Once you start winning here, you can outcompete, outbuy any other club, and you will stay on top of the business here. But basically, this whole thing only works. This whole problem only works within these really expensive and high money leagues, because in a system where people aren't even professional athletes, and it isn't about who can play what player, then all these problems are way smaller. So I think it's correct if we talk about the Premier League and so on. But yes, first.
Okay, you said that the players had already decided, the fans had already decided what sports they were interested in. Why are you only interested in the structural disadvantage within football and not interested in the structural disadvantage between sports? For example, fans might have selected against women's sports because they were sexist back in the day. Why should we not prioritise that structural disadvantage?
I have no qualms at all if the state wants to spend more money on equality, but I think just here, if the choice was made, then it works here. But simply because the structure, so this monopoly structure is different in terms of between sports and within a league. So, what we have here, why we have the right to do it basically, are two things. The first of all is that we have a monopoly kind of thing, where the huge clubs basically have the power to keep anyone else from succeeding. What's happening, the best example I know is from the German Bundesliga, where Bayern Munich has been dominating for the past 25 years overall. And anytime another club really rises up for a year or two, like Borussia Dortmund in the last couple of years, then their top players are bought out of their contracts and go over to Bayern Munich. Even if Bayern doesn't even need these players, just the reason for weakening their competitors is enough for them to spend huge amount of monies, because they know they will get it back in terms of prize money. So it's not just that they simply are good themselves and could spend more on coaches or more on playing fields. They have an incentive to actively weaken anyone else. And we believe this is a very negative kind of thinking about sports, and that's why, because the money infringes basically on the ability of other teams to compete, it is a right to take it away. Three more things here, especially if you have these huge sports, they are national business. So the state so they are helped by state infrastructure. All these playing pitches in schools and everywhere around where people start playing sports are not paid by these huge companies, they are paid by the state. The state TV covers it, so that's basically free advertising for the sports that is not paid by these huge clubs, but by the state overall. These sports, most are the sports that are most often taught in schools. So in schools, in PE class, for example. So additional free advertising. So we can see all this huge interest, all this popularity of the sport isn't solely on the basis of the work done by these huge clubs. But it was provided for them by the state, and that is why it is okay to take away parts of their money, because they didn't earn it themselves, but the community overall created this money. So what happens if we basically equalize the money that is gained overall? Means that clubs can be used less as an investment than it is today. We see this mainly, for example, in the British Premier League, where a lot of the huge clubs are owned by single people who are partly in it to earn money, to get money out of it by being successful. But the result is here that their aim is not creating the best community possible, but just targeting the places where they get money and the fans where they get money. That's why, for example, for Chelsea, the ticket prices have tripled or quadrupled over the last couple of years, because they found a group of fans that is willing to pay this thing here. That means that basically this way of doing sports makes it less accessible for anyone else. But once the clubs realize that the only way for them to get more money is to increase the money pool of the whole league overall, they have an interest to work together with the other clubs to find a way to make the game overall more popular, to target all the possible audiences, because all the money will be shared out. And this is why I believe that taxes at 40% or higher are a lovely thing, and redistribution will only benefit the sports overall.
Sports is so much more than the game that's being played in front of our eyes. It's also about the communities that go into building that team. From Closing Opposition, we're going to bring you a realistic picture of how sports work. We're going to talk about how you, on the government team, disempower poor areas. But before that, a few extraneous rebuttals. Mainly clarifications, because we think the characterization coming from government was just like crazy. So first thing, this idea that poor teams can't afford anything and they just can't pay the fees, etc., etc., etc. Here's the first thing I want to point out, that we're talking about redistribution within the league. We're not talking about rich teams being forced to donate to charities for poor communities in very, very vast different leagues in underprivileged nations. That's like a different motion. That's like forcing sports teams to donate to charity. So by nature, if you are in the NBA or the NFL, you can probably afford to be in the NBA or the NFL. In this case, poorer does not mean poor. It just means that relatively speaking, you still have millions of dollars, you just aren't as rich as the guy who has maybe $100 million. So we think you might not be able to afford the most expensive coach possible, but you'll still be more or less fine. We reject this wrong characterization of these teams being stuck in like poverty. That's just a different debate and a different context entirely. No thank you. But second of all, we don't think redistribution actually helps poorer teams. The reason for this is that there are a limited number of famous players and famous or experienced coaches. There's just a set number of them. So what happens is when you redistribute wealth from wealthy teams to poorer teams, what happens is more teams start bidding on coaches and players. So what happens is you drive up the price of these coaches and players, because now it's not just Manchester United that's bidding on this team, it's also a poorer team that previously you just decided to coach their own coach and develop their own local coaches. Now what you do is you transfer them, you make them think that they should be bidding on those expensive coaches, you drive up the price of this, you end up spending even more on coaches, spending even more on famous players, rather than poorer, smaller teams deciding to build their own players and build their own coaches. Which leads us on to this third and final idea, no thank you, that these rich sports teams apparently monopolize sports. We don't think this is the case. We think money is useful, we don't want to deny that, but it isn't the only thing that determines success. This is why we can see Leicester City winning the EPL, right Hamish? Yep, I'm not the sports guy, he is. This is why we can see Leicester City winning the EPL, because they coach their own players, they have their own coaches and they develop internally, rather than be stuck in this bidding war, because now they have this pool of money that you must use to compete against richer clubs to get the best coaches. I'll take closing.
Most sports can't be dominated by a single star player, so these star players will be spread out over the league instead of just all being into one person. Doesn't it make more clubs popular everywhere?
Yeah, so we don't think that star players are necessarily good for teams. For example, when the LA Galaxy team in Los Angeles, like they bought over David Beckham and we never heard of him again, we think teams have other means to penetrate the sports community and win tournaments. They do it by nurturing their own players, their local communities, rather than buying into this bidding game, which is what you want them to do. You want to say that sports is now about the money, we redistribute the money, so you make sure that you have access, you play the money game, rather than doing your own thing as a local team. No thank you. So we're going to talk about our extension, how this disempowers poor areas. And we have to be very careful here because we think this is very wrong characterization coming from all teams. You want to give you a real context of what happens on the grounds with sports, how it relates to communities. First premise, which is a bit counterintuitive, we think that many rich, successful teams actually come from poor areas. What are examples of this? Just empirically. Manchester United doesn't come from a particularly rich city, but they are a rich club. The same can be said about Birmingham or Liverpool. Number two, even a team such as Arsenal, which is located in a big city like London, is born out of the poorer areas of those cities. They started poor and now they've established themselves as rich, successful clubs that use that area as their own home base. But this is more than just the UK or the US, it's also about developing countries like Malaysia, where we see less developed states such as Kelantan and Terengganu having very strong teams being sent to national leagues. So the conclusion to this is that rich teams don't mean they come from rich areas. Very oftentimes, poor areas usually produce rich teams. No thank you. Why is this the case? So that was the empirical evidence. What is the theory behind this? The first is that there's very strong community buy-in to sports in these areas. School children see this as the it thing. But second of all, sports is seen as an escape. There's usually a strong sporting culture compared to rich urban areas which rather consume sport than participate in it. So the conclusion to this is twofold. The first is that empirically we see a very strong correlation between rich teams being based in poor areas and usually being born out of poverty. But second of all, we see many rich successful teams have historical roots in poorer areas. So this comes to the third and final premise of this argument. Why does redistribution harm poorer communities? I'll take opening.
The rich teams coming out of poorer areas is because they started before the league became as huge as they are. They can't do that anymore because all the good players that come from their area just move somewhere far away because the rich team.
This is not necessarily the case. So usually the case is that they win the league once, like Leicester City does. They get all that money and they use that as a one-off injection to start building their local community and their football club. We think that's the more realistic picture. They start poor, they become rich, but it doesn't mean that they have lost their roots in these poorer communities necessarily as well. So why does redistribution harm poorer communities? The first thing is that we see on their side, what's likely to happen is that rich communities start pulling out of these programs that invest in poorer communities. So on our side, what actually happens in the status quo? Yes, Manchester United is a money-grubbing club, but they do balance it out with some charity. So we see them funding local programs in their local communities in Manchester. We see them setting up nurturing programs, football training programs with mentors for all these underprivileged kids. And these programs, these talent-seeking programs, are usually stepping stones for these other players to come into the team. So the comparison within our sides is, for our side, we have these programs. But on their side, what happens is when you reduce funding, when you reduce all the excesses you talk about, they're not going to keep investing in these poorer communities. What's more likely to happen is you reduce funding these programs so you can still play the money game with bidding. You can't, in your side of the house, no thank you, they don't have enough money to both pay for an expensive coach and be able to completely fund this program. So you can see less funding on their side of the house. Most of them can pass this off as we're still being charitable because we're redistributing it to other rich teams, which are poorer than us, but are still pretty rich. So you're going to see less facilities, less local investment, and less role models in these poorer communities. But second of all, we also see less talent seeking among these poorer communities because you need to build infrastructure in these poorer communities. We do it now because they have that excess money. Like, why not have an expensive, unprofitable program to seek out poor talent? But on your side, it's seen as like they don't have the luxury of affording the access anymore. More so because their rival teams are not going to be setting up these programs anymore because they too aren't investing in this infrastructure because they too don't have the money to do so. But the third, so what happens is you deprioritize these programs. What happens is they need the money to afford other things. They want to play the main game. They can't they have less investment, not necessarily no investment, but less so in these clubs. There's less mobility in sports. These poorer communities are the ones that are truly disadvantaged. But third of all, there are poor teams who do make it. For example, Leicester City. They do become successful. They are born out of poverty, and what you do is the moment they get that 150 million euros, you take the money away from them and redistribute it to other teams. They need this one-off injection. This is their pride. This is what they work for. They deserve this money. They deserve this escape from the poorer communities. We're very proud to propose for sports.
Great, I thank the opposition member for that speech and call on a government work here.
So in this debate, we've essentially discussed the question whether it's worth for a league as a whole to have this redistribution within the league, within clubs that are richer to poor clubs. In my speech, I want to show basically three things. First of all, why is it legitimate that we talk about mainly large leagues? Why can we encourage the redistribution from really rich clubs in those leagues to the relatively poorer clubs, and as Konrad has shown? How does this redistribution lead to benefits for the league as a whole, for communities within the league that are associated to the league? And why do we therefore can argue that this is a very, very useful and efficient mechanism? So first of all, the issue we have, and Konrad has shown this, is we have sport, which is a competition, which lives from the competition. Sport is not music, as opening opposition wanted to tell us. In music, you can benefit from Queen without having the Beatles. You can like one band without the other. But in sports, you can't enjoy the game if you have one enormously successful club and the other ones are without any prospect of being in reach of that club. So in sports, we need a high degree of competition to make the sport enjoyable, because it is about competition, because it is about being a team being strong, and for this you have to be within reach. You have to have competition. So therefore, why does it hurt if they're really rich clubs? So Konrad has told you that those monopolies or even monop zones in this that they have no thanks, and that they draw all the demand from basically all the demand of good players from other clubs. It's basically as if you were a community and had a good team, and then suddenly 10 out of your 11 football players are bought up from the other club for being too much of a competition, and then your club can no longer compete. And this is inherently unfair, and it hurts the competition and therefore the club. Well, yes.
You still haven't shown that these smaller clubs are actually deserving of this. You've asserted that they are structurally disadvantaged because of historical things, but in reality, as both of us have told you, they are often owned by rich benefactors, but just haven't served their members properly, which is why they don't have high membership and advertising.
Yeah, sure. Let me tackle this issue. So what CEO told us is that those rich clubs have made their way up to rich. But if you think about it, many of those rich clubs were generally just large clubs. They were successful because they had a large youth they trained, they had talents they picked out. And what happened then is that large, rich investors bought those clubs out of prestige because they wanted to be owners of a large, important club. Just think of Chelsea, which is owned by a Russian oligarch who made his money in oil. He did not profit from Chelsea being successful in talent hunting. He bought Chelsea just because of this reason. So the successful clubs don't necessarily are successful because their success didn't make them rich. Their success made them attractive for people who wanted to invest them, who saw them as a gamble as an investment. No thanks. So what do we get now by this redistribution? So first of all, clubs, right now clubs have a sort of interest in a zero-sum game, in destroying other clubs' potentials to be more successful, to have the better competition. We can eliminate this by evening the play field. If all clubs are relatively equal in their wealth, there's no more buying up all the good players from one club because the clubs can no longer afford this. They are relatively poorer. No thanks. Why will it still not hurt communities but rather benefit communities? So what I've already mentioned is that important successful clubs used to draw their good players from their own communities. They did a lot of training for their youth. They did a lot of academies. And if they are forced back into this position, they will be forced to do more academies. They will be forced more to care about their communities, about their members, which opposition denied. They will be forced more on the core of the society and no longer on the capitalist, basically, background of the football market that it has become, in this case football. But it also applies to other sports. Yeah, sure, close.
Can you deal with the analysis that Aaron specifically gave you that this is taking money away from traditionally poor areas into worse parts of the world, and tell us why that is justified simply because the owners are rich?
Yeah, the misconception you have is that the wealth of those clubs is distributed among the poor areas where supporters are from. And this is wrong, because these clubs have members in poor areas, but they don't necessarily benefit from their club being rich. It's not like Chelsea starts distributing money in their area or menu for this respect. What they do, in fact, is they are rich clubs, and basically the wealth or the revenues of those clubs benefit their investors, their shareholders, not their members, which are basically stakeholders, which have interests in these clubs. So when you tell me that poor areas benefit from rich clubs, that's not necessarily the case. Instead, if, as Konrad told you, clubs like Chelsea have quadrupled their fees for watching a game, this actually hurts poor areas in which those people follow those clubs. So instead, what we should do by evening the play field is we enable all clubs to basically care, to no longer hurt by no longer hurting other clubs because they're so rich. Instead, they have an incentive to focus on their community work. And as also opening government has shown you, this competitiveness makes sports such a good for our society. It does make people think about working ethics. It does improve team spirit, and these effects can be no thanks. These effects can be a lot can in fact only be achieved if we make sure that sports stays competitive. No thanks. No interested. So these points can only be reached if we ensure that the play field, like the large clubs, basically distribute money to poorer clubs of the societies, because then they have an interest to buy into, to get back interested in their own societies, from which they emerged before they were bought up by large investors, essentially. This this makes it the lower potential of revenues makes it potentially more feasible for them to lower attendance to like ticket prices, and thus actually present an opportunity for poor communities from which they may have originally risen up from, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to provide this by this policy, make sure that within the league money is redistributed to solve the problems that have emerged by those clubs becoming large. It solves the problem of the monopolies that in generally inhibit competitiveness in those in those leagues. And because sports is such an important good that has so many benefits for our society, we should strongly propose this motion. Thanks.
So I really like sports motions. I think they're great because sports matters to people. Sport is what impacts people's lives. As much as we like to talk about how much people care about like government narratives and all that crap, ultimately at the end of the day, people go home at the end of a hard job and they watch Manchester United. They watch the Cleveland Browns lose. They watch some form of sport that brings entertainment to their lives. So the narratives that we send out through those sports are vitally important. At the moment we tell people you can present unjustified tax to help fund communities in the middle of nowhere who don't give a damn about their team, at the moment you tell them you want to take money out of poor areas, take them away from the one thing you care about to give it to someone who's like terrible at making a team, we don't think that's a good thing for any league to present. We think it goes against the ideals of sports that we like. Like, I'm going to look at two kind of key areas in my speech. Firstly, it's sports culture and how we think we directly impact people through that. And then secondly, looking at good entertainment and how we improve the degree of these leagues. So firstly, on this idea of sports culture and like how we actually impact people. And this is kind of like the core of Aaron's point, because sport it really is important to people, and we think specifically it's important to poorer people. Why is that the case? Because it tends to be people from poorer areas of like historically and still to this day see sport as a way in which to like feel united with their people around them, to feel a sense of community spirit, and to take entertainment in something where they can't go out and like spend a lot of money on fancy cars. They can't spend a lot of money on other forms of entertainment that have traditionally been things used by more wealthy individuals. We think that therefore we see clubs specifically in poorer areas. We think what's also important to analyse is when they tell you like this is just because they existed before the leagues before leagues were around. This is not the case, because still to this day it tends to be the fan response and the amount of money that fans put into leagues in poorer areas is simply higher. We think there are far more football fans in poor working class areas, and there are far more like baseball fans in poor working class areas. Any sport you name, we think you can see a direct link between the largest like big sports and poorer areas. It tends to be more marginal sports that are like enjoyed by more like wealthy groups. So when there's this huge entertainment industry, we think it's very important that we are very protective over it and protective over how we present it. Because when we tell them that like progressive taxation, it's like directly used to bring money out of these poorer areas and into areas where, quite frankly, we think the teams are going to be like less supported, they're going to have fewer fans. That's probably likely why they haven't had a lot of money in the past. That's probably likely why they're not doing so well. We think, secondly, you get a huge focus on money. Suddenly it doesn't it's not about building up community spirit. It's not about like teams building themselves from the ground up. And a really important narrative that we still see to this day, we look at like the Leicester Foxes, we look at like the Cubs in America, these teams that have worked themselves from the ground up to achieve greatness. We think these are great narratives where lost at the moment, they all comes all about the money. Now let's look at let's look at money, because money does matter. Because OG tells us like they're going to create jobs. Let's be clear, they're moving jobs from one area to another. They are moving jobs away from a stadium that could have been built in Manchester, a stadium that could have been in like Cleveland, Ohio, to some larger like a place in like presumably the middle of nowhere. That's why like their fans aren't like coming to their games already, and like specifically pumping money into an area of the economy that is less important. And we are ultimately going to say we should strive less to affect. So we think like specifically with the groups we're taking this money away from are likely to be large clubs in poorer areas. We think they're likely to go to small clubs that are all over the place. It might be the case that some of these clubs are in poorer areas, but we think on average it's likely to be like a mixture of areas, not necessarily the best place. Because let's be clear, this is like a real economic impact. The economies of many areas, multi-million-dollar stadiums, these are huge things. We can't just brush this away by being like, oh, they're owned by rich people. There's no real impact, like it's not helping anyone. I'll take clothing.
Your rich clubs from poor areas were just some random examples. I mean, Paris, Munich, and London are the rich capital cities. Wouldn't you want to give the money from these central area clubs to poorer areas that they have their own academies to foster their own players?
As Aaron specifically analysed, in these larger cities, it tends to be the poorer areas in which these clubs exist. Even more so, even if that is the case, it doesn't stop the fact that the vast majority, like a large number of these teams are in poorer areas. We don't think that that should be your principle in any case. No, thank you. How do we help those who lack access to sport? Because this appears to be what the Gov care about. Like, we think it is like literally a burden on the government, not these leagues. We're quite quickly willing to say this. It's unclear why a league's fault that like people don't tend to turn out to their local club in like an entirely different league. Some direct connection between wealthy teams and like poor leagues just doesn't appear to be apparent on their case. We are unsure why it is their responsibility. It is unclear who benefits this, because I think what's very important to notice is like sport is just delocalized these days. I'm a Scottish guy who supports a team from a tiny town in Wisconsin, go Pack, and I think it's very important to say that this is like the nature of sports nowadays. Like it's not like you need to have like your local club be doing well to enjoy sports. If they're going to tell us like people love sports wherever it is. They just love sports. We think that what is important is these like local areas that built up communities around their sports are still supported to this day. Let's look at entertainment. No thanks. Because OG tells us there's a problem, which is like teams can't afford to go to competitions apparently, and like they can't afford equipment. We think what was really unclear is like who these teams were. We don't think we got any specific. We got lots of examples of teams who were going to be taxed. No examples of who these are going to. I tried to ask in a POI like who these teams are going to. I didn't get it. Like I watch a lot of NFL, MLB, and FIFA games. I don't remember any team not showing up to their game because they couldn't afford to buy a coach. Like this is just not true that these leagues they don't have like teams are unable to compete. If they mean moving money between leagues, like one is like Aaron points out, that's not in the motion. But secondly, like it's unclear why it is Man United's responsibility to allow for like the financial failures of another team. Most people like don't give a crap about League 3 teams anyway. We think people care far more about Manchester United anyway. If we're maxing utility, we're going to focus on the big teams. We're going to focus on your New England Patriots. No, thank you. Equality in sporting. This is a kind of a big idea. We get better sport through equality. Let's just be clear. That is not achieved through this motion. That is not how it works. It's about the structure of the league itself. That's why we look at things like the NFL, which has a very has things like salary caps in place and drafting rules that allow them to have competitive sport without taking away the profit motives of the clubs themselves. We think specifically the thing that you're taking away is like the money that you're taking away is like one going towards the people who own the club. We think that's fair to say, but also going towards things like like new stadiums, like things for fans. We think that it tends to be that teams spend a fairly even amount of money. So like where does this money go? Because we think it's like spending tends to be largely similar between teams because there is no incentive for you to increase the spending on your own team because then every other team is going to do the same. So the money that you are taking away, this excess capital, is going to go towards like increasing every away from things like fan facilities, things that are outside the sport but are still vitally important. A quick comparison of benefits and harms because we get told like possibly more equal leagues. As I tell you, this could be achieved in other ways. It is achieved in other ways. We don't think that therefore is a particularly big benefit. What does it do? It screws over poor areas, teams they care about, it screws over the jobs in these areas, and it prevents a bad image. It's unjustified. You're taxing an enterprise for something that's not their fault. And finally, it promotes bad sport. It's all about the money. We don't think that's true. We like sport. Oppose.
Well done, thank you. Well done.